good evening, everyone. It's my great honor to be able to be in conversation with Professor Nye. If you don't mind, I can call you May.
Yes,
Um,
fine. Yes,
and
absolutely.
I thought I could just get started because I know that I understand you have a personal relationship with Corky Lee. So if you can just tell me who Corky Lee is, both professionally as well as personally to you.
Corky Lee is or was an Asian American photographer who is known for having taken photographs of New York Chinatown and Asian Americans across the country for 50 continuous years from 1970 to 2021 when he passed away from COVID-19. I knew Corky back in the day in the 1970s when we were both young radicals making trouble. I would just say good trouble in the community. And over the years, he was ubiquitous. He was at every event that was held. And so I didn't go to every event, but he was at every event. He was a fixture in our community and he documented everything that Asian Americans were involved in. I last saw Corky in 2019. At the time, I was directing the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, the Ethnic Studies program at Columbia. And I invited him up to Columbia to mount a show. We have a small gallery in our center, and I thought we should have his photographs there. So he came up that year and we talked about it, and he couldn't decide on a theme for his exhibit because it could be so many things. But then, it got delayed and then COVID happened in early 2020 and it was never completed. That was the last I saw him.
Thank you for sharing the story, but I'm just curious about kind of what moved you to undertake this project of editing this book, which is like a monumental collection of his important work.
I was invited to collaborate on this book by Corky's brother, John Lee, who is the sole surviving relative of Corky's, his surviving sibling, and the executor of his estate. John had been approached by an editor at Penguin Random House, a young Asian American woman. And I should just say parenthetically, this I think is proof positive of the importance of diversity in the publishing business, because she knew who Corky Lee was. And she told John, I want to do a book of his photos. So John reached out to me as an Asian American historian and scholar, and to Chi Wong Ing, who is a colleague of Corky's, also a photographer, who worked with him over the years on many photographic projects. So the three of us collaborated on this book together.
Thank you. Just looking for the unmute button. So I have here just a few slides so that because this is a visual work that our audience at home can get a sense of the kind of work that he did. As you can see here, that one of the titles is 50 Years of Photographic Justice. Can you tell us what that phrase, photographic justice, means in general and what it specifically means for Corky Lee and his work?
Photographic justice was Corky's own phrase that he used to describe his intention and his life's work. Corky was a self-taught photographer, and you can see the evolution of his art over 50 years in the book. But he was also always primarily motivated by breaking stereotypes, as he said. He said, my goal is to break stereotypes about Asian Americans, one photograph at a time. He said he wanted to show Asian Americans and Chinese Americans as real people with real issues, real concerns, and that Chinatown was a real place, not just a tourist drive-by. You can see here on the cover of the photograph of a lion dance in Chinatown. And this troupe is interesting because it was a lion dance troupe comprised of Chinese Americans. They weren't immigrants, they weren't immigrant kids, they were Chinese Americans, and Corky followed them over the years. And I'm very pleased to say that when we have our book launch in New York Chinatown, the that same club, I mean, it's different people now because it's some time has passed, but that same club is going to do a lion dance when we launch the book. So photographic justice for Corky was a matter of tearing down stereotypes. He wanted to show that Asian Americans were not passive, they were not docile, they resisted their oppression and discrimination, and they were Americans. That was something Corky believed very deeply, that Asian Americans were Americans and they were part of American history, part of American society. And he said, don't let anybody tell you to go back to where you came from. He says, you're from America. You're an American.
So just for further context, there are one of his favorite subjects were photographs of the Chinese American community within Chinatown. And this is a favorite subject of a lot of photographers, dating back to the 19th century even. And I'm thinking in particular of the German American photographer Arnold Genthe, who took photographs of San Francisco's Chinatown. But what's notable is that he was a white man who came in and captured the kind of exotic, what for him was the exotic elements of Chinatown. So, what was distinctive about Corky Lee's perspective on Chinatown? What made his photographs an exceptional departure from this larger kind of exoticizing tradition? You talked a little bit about stereotypes. What made him different from people like Arnold Genthe and others?
That's a great question. Thanks. Corky was one of the first, maybe not the first, but he was one of the first Chinese American photographers to photograph Chinatown from the inside. He was not an outsider looking in. He did not have the gaze of the outsider. He was photographing people who were his friends, his brothers, his community. And that really shows in his photographs. Corky's subjects are not, they're not passive, but they're also not abject. You know, there's also a tradition of social photography in the United States that grows up in the 20th century. And it's different from Gente's exotic Orientals. But I'm thinking of people like Dorothea Lange, you know, whose photographs during the Depression showed abject subjects, and they were meant to invoke sympathy from white people. Corky's subjects were never abject; they were never exotic. As he would always say, they are real people with real concerns. And I think if you look at the pictures in this book, you really get a sense that this is somebody in the community, not outside of the community.
And it's really clear in photographs like this, where he was very much part of kind of the protests, the activism that was challenging the injustices that were visited upon Asian American communities, that he was very much part of the activism. So in many ways, it seems to me that his camera was active, but that he was it actually on the ground documenting the movement, but the camera itself was integral to the movement. So I'm really curious, but also about kind of the types of photographs he took. So these are examples of it, protest photographs, but can you perhaps describe, I'm just kind of guessing a few photographs that were really resonating with me, but describe one image in your mind that really is meaningful for you, that you thought might exemplify like his compassionate vision of Asian American communities.
Do you want to show the photograph of Vincent Chin? Do you want to show that? It's not on your screen, I don't think. You've got the cover on the screen.
I'm not sure. Can you see which one do you see?
I have the cover on my screen.
Oh, it's not moving forward. Okay.
I think you might have to start slideshow.
I did start, but it's one of those moments in Zoom that doesn't do what I want it to do. Let's see.
Yeah, there it is.
This is it. Yeah.
Yeah. Vincent Chin was a Chinese American in Detroit. He, in 1982, he was celebrating his wedding, which was supposed to take place the next day at a bar with some friends. And when he left, he was viciously attacked by two white auto workers. 1982 was when a lot of Americans were blaming Japanese cars for unemployment in the auto industry. And so they mistook him for a Japanese American, which is, I'm sure Asians in the audience will know this is a common problem that we face of mistaken identity, so-called mistaken identity. And they beat him to death with a baseball bat. And they were charged with his death. They were charged with manslaughter. But in the end, the judge ruled that the judge he was convicted. They were convicted of manslaughter, but they were given a $3,000 fine and no jail time. And that was such an outrage to Asian Americans everywhere. Corky flew to Detroit because he knew he had to be there for this event, and a broad coalition of people demonstrated against the judge's ruling. That was their slogan, "It's not fair." And this murder of Vincent Chin, I think, was a kind of catalyst for Asian American activism in the 1980s. You know, there had been activism. Well, we've always had activism in our communities, but I think after the radical 1970s, by the 1980s, you know, there was, I won't say complacency, but there was a different mood, I think, in the community where people thought things maybe were getting better. And this was such a huge shock. And a famous movie was made, Who Killed Vincent Chin, made by Christine Choi and Renee Tajima-Pena, which was nominated for an Academy Award. And that film is still shown in high school and college campuses 30 years later.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I didn't realize that I was unmuted. Yeah, this is an incredible photograph, and it shows just the energy and the activism that was so crucial to building a sense of Asian American community. And he was so much a part of both documenting it and feeding off that energy and supporting it. He's sometimes been described as a documentary photographer, like documenting Asian American activism, but that was a label that was uncomfortable for him, as I understand it from the book. Can you just elaborate a little bit about kind of the term documentary photographer and what were some of the what's helpful about that particular description, and what is limiting about it for understanding kind of his work and his legacy?
Well, Corky did want to document the community and its events and struggles, but I think he saw himself as an activist and not merely an observer. So I think there's that aspect where a documentarian suggests somebody who is merely an observer. And Corky was always kind of a part of the action, but also a little bit not a part of it because he was behind the camera. So that part is true. He's also often called a photojournalist, and he welcomed that description of himself, but he also thought it was limiting. Corky had his own run-ins with editorial gatekeepers in the mainstream press who did not always want to print his photographs. And so, you know, he did have some of his first big splash was a photograph during a demonstration against police brutality in 1975 in front of City Hall. And he captured this amazing shot, and he ran downtown to the New York Post, and it got published in that afternoon's newspaper. So that was kind of what started his career as a photojournalist. But he also had, I think he had a famous picture of the protest against Miss Saigon, the Broadway musical that was full of racist and sexist stereotypes, that was printed in the New York Times. So he did have his photographs published in the mainstream media. but they're also often refused his photographs. And he liked to tell a story of when he took a photo of Chinese elderly women demonstrating against Yves Saint Laurent's opium perfume.
Mm.
And he, they had signs that said opium kills, stop opium perfume. And it's a great photo. It's in the book. And he took it to the Post, and the editor said, nah, I'm not interested. I don't want it. So Corky was very disappointed, and he hung around, and he went back to the night editor later that evening, and the night editor accepted it and printed it. Well, the day editor was furious, and he told Corky, you will never publish in my newspaper again. So, Corky always fought for the mainstream media to show what Asian Americans were doing. He wanted the general public to know about our community's issues and struggles, but he wasn't always able to convince the editors of that. So his work then, I think, in a sense, took on a broader importance to him, which was one of creating an archive of our community, of our struggles, and in that sense, to document what Asian America was doing.
The book tells an incredible story of how he was able to be there at all the important events. So what gave him the edge? Why was he able to go out there before anybody else? How did he get the scoop?
Aha, this is in the day before social media, before you had Instagram and Facebook and emails. Corky had a day job. I mean, I should say that all this photographic work he took of demonstrations like the one of Vincent Chin, he did it on his own dime. He did it in his own time, and nobody paid him except on some rare occasions where the New York Times paid him for a photograph. So he had a day job, and Corky's day job for, I don't know, many years, maybe at least 15 years, was he worked at a print shop in New York City called Expedia. And Expedia was a progressive print shop. It was run by a progressive Chinese man named Sam Chen. And everybody brought their leaflets and their newspapers to Expedia because they were inexpensive and they were known to support progressive causes. So as the salesperson or the what did he call it? The account executive at Expedia, he had knowledge of all these events before they took place. So then he was able to show up. So he was very clever in that way.
So sometimes what he was doing, he didn't like the term documentation, but to create an archive in many ways is also to correct kind of what's missing in the archive. And so what was most extraordinary to me is the iconic photograph that is meant to document the celebrations after the last spike, after the completion of the National Railroad. So it's a very famous photograph. It's been written about by a lot of writers, including me, not about me. But what was interesting, fascinating, is something that I wasn't aware of, is that Corky took it upon himself to redo this photograph. So if I can show this one again, there's a lot of people in here. It's meant to show to celebrate all of the folks who were integral to the building of the National Railroad. But what's remarkable here is the labor that was pivotal to the actual building of the railroad, the Chinese men who built it. And some have later on said that, well, actually, there's one Chinese laborer in there. You can kind of see him. I was struggling to see him, but he's so blurred, you don't see him. But the larger point remains that our archival histories, our national archival histories, are ones of erasure, right? Of erasures of the folks that were denied citizenship, the people who are always left to the margins, but did so much to construct, to build this nation. And so if you can just tell the story of how this photograph came to be.
So the original photograph was taken in 1869 when the two sections of the railroad, the western section and the eastern section, meet. And they meet in Utah at Promontory Point. And there's a golden spike that's driven into the last railroad tie, and there's this big celebration. And there are no Chinese, or there's possibly one Chinese in the photograph, even though upwards of 20,000 Chinese worked on the western side of the railroad. They labored through winters. They dug the tunnels through the Sierra Mountains, Sierra Nevada mountains. Many of them died. They lived inside snowbanks during the winter because they had to work year round to complete their section. So they really were heroes. I mean, working on the eastern side of the railroad was not easy work, but it did not face the formidable challenges that the western section did. And Corky saw this photograph when he was in junior high school. And he knew, like all Chinese Americans know, that we built the railroad. You know, if we know anything about our history, we know that. And he said, "Where are the Chinese?" And he was infuriated. And so many years later, he decided that he would recreate that scene with Asian Americans. And in 2014, he started a campaign. Everybody meet in Promontory Point. We're going to recreate the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. So I think over 250 people showed up. And this was in large part because of the contacts and organizing that Corky had done over the years. And he knew people everywhere. And it snowballed into this huge event. And it included, I'm not sure how many, but it included not a small number of Chinese Americans who were direct descendants of railroad workers. So Corky believed this was his most important work. He said it was a quintessential act of photographic justice.
Thank you for telling us this deeply moving story. I'm just always so struck about kind of the work of an image as showing how people are working towards justice, and the image itself producing kind of a just image that corrects the injustices of the past, an image that overrides or disregards or renders invisible the tremendous sacrifices of Asian American laborers who were integral to building of the railroad. I'm really struck by how important his work is to Asian American history, not just the Asian American visual history, but also Asian American history more broadly. So I'm mindful also of the fact that this event is based within Canada here. And so if we can just maybe reflect a moment on what his legacy might be to kind of an Asian diaspora, the connections maybe between Canada and the United States as both settler colonies, and what we can take from the lessons that he has tried to build through his visual practice for what activism might mean for kind of an Asian Canadian, for Asian Canadian photographers or Asian Canadian activists.
I'm not sure if there are photographs that Corky took in Canada, but there are many touch points of similarities between Asian Canadian and Asian American experiences. And there are also some differences. So it's interesting to explore both the similarities and the differences. Some of the biggest similarities are that after the United States passed the Chinese exclusion law, Canada did a similar thing, right? And Canada's immigration laws, I think in general, mimicked American law. They took American immigration laws as their models. Canada has also had many refugee populations in the mid and late 20th century, people from Vietnam, people from China, and that's another similarity. I don't know if if Asian Americans or Asian Canadians suffered from racism during the coronavirus pandemic, that was, I would imagine so, because it was really pronounced in the United States, but I know that it also took place in Europe, and other countries. So you're nodding your head, right? So this is, the anti-China politics and the anti-Chinese politics is really a global phenomenon. So it's not surprising that we would have that problem both in Canada and in the United States. I think this book also gives you a historical arc of Asian Americans' struggles and quests for social justice and inclusion and equality across the late 20th century. And, Corky's photos are all over the internet. If you Google Corky Lee, you'll see a lot of different photographs. But if we put the book together in chronological order, and then in that way, you see the growth of a movement. You see its emergence in the 1970s of activism among young people, labor unions, working class people, immigrants. And in the 80s and 90s, you see the increased diversity of Asian American populations with large numbers of people coming from Korea, from South Asia, the Philippines, etc. And you see the growth of struggles for empowerment, electoral struggles to have representation in local and national elected office, as well as representation in film and theater, and the creative arts themselves, Asian Americans producing creative work. And then the last chapter we have in the 2000s and 2010s, it's a chapter we call Resilience, and I think it's remarkable that that chapter starts with 9/11 and it ends with the coronavirus pandemic. And those are two moments where Asian Americans, even though many people believe that they had accomplished quite a bit in terms of their getting better jobs, being represented in the professions, being more accepted in American society, that can disappear in a moment, right? And there was a flurry of hate attacks, violent attacks, and the haters didn't care if you were a garment worker or someone who worked on Wall Street, right? So the last photographs that Corky took were in 2020. This was a demonstration in Columbus Park in Chinatown in New York. And he also took a series of photographs of the community that summer and winter of 2020 to show that Chinese people were the victims of the virus, not its cause. So he had lovely photos of, a lady selling hand sanitizer on the street in the middle of the winter, or a man, in a luncheonette selling zhongzi, a grab and go sticky rice snacks. And he asked people to pose in front of their favorite restaurants that were closed. So he has a whole series of photographs of people standing in front of their favorite restaurants. And we know some of them are still closed today. So I think those are very moving pictures, and they show that he also had honed a very special kind of eye in the, to capture what was going on in the community.
He seemed really undaunted, even in the midst of kind of a fearful time where none of us, like it wasn't that long ago, none of us felt safe going out, and yet he didn't stop him, this man who should be retired. So it's, deeply moving that he died of coronavirus, right? While documenting kind of his latest days of activism.
Yeah, he always wore a mask. He was very careful. But, at that time, December of 2020, was before there were any vaccines, and the virus was very potent at that time. So he was 73 years old, And he caught it on one of these outings, and he passed away in January of 2021.
He leaves behind so much. The question that I was asking about his work for everyone, I think it's encapsulated in the book. Potri Ranka Manis writes, his advocacy has gone beyond the islands of New York to the global audience, where the energy of the people immortalized in his photos bring consciousness and a call for solidarity to the world. Um, he leaves behind an incredible archive, but also this inspiring message about what photography can do in the world, how it can move people. Were there any photos that you wanted to include in the book that you that didn't quite make it in? Were there any outtakes or any? Just tell us a little bit about the making of the book and how you arrived at a decision about what to include and what wasn't able to make it in there.
Corky was estimated that he took 200 photographs a week. So if you do the math, it's over 500,000 over the course of his career. But we had a very clear strategy. We knew that Corky had always wanted to publish a book of his own, of his work. And in 2011, he started a project to self-publish a book of his photographs. And he selected 100 photographs for that book. And he worked with Chi Wang Eng, he was my co-editor, and they made a mock-up, for the book, and he gave it a title called Not on the Menu. And a friend donated money to buy the paper. So he was very serious about publishing his own book. But you know how things go, he just didn't finish it, didn't get around to finishing it. So we started with that group of 100 photos, because it was obvious to us that that was what Corky believed was his best work, right? The ones that he chose to publish. Then we had another 10 years to cover. So for that section, for those years, we used photographs that Corky exhibited in one-man shows or group shows, again, with the rationale that these were photos he considered to be his best work, and also photos that he loaned to other creative projects like filmmakers for them to use. So those two groups we also considered to be what Corky thought was his best work, right? So we had a core of photographs that we think we can safely say Corky believed these were his best photographs. And then we added some, we rounded out the themes to make sure there was sufficient diversity. His self-published book was mostly of Chinatown. And we knew, and, we wanted the book to show that he was had a vision beyond one community, right, in New York City. So we kind of rounded out some of the themes, and we found some slides in old metal boxes that had never been seen before, and some of them are real gems. So we said we got to include those. There's a picture of the Black Panther Party speaking at a storefront in Chinatown of Iwo Kyun in 1972, I think. So that's in the book. But in general, we used the core of what we used was from Corky's own selections. So there, I don't know, something like 250 photographs in the book. There are some that lovely photographs that we didn't include just because we didn't want to be too repetitive, or, it's always an editorial decision what you select and what you leave out. But I think we're generally pleased with the representation.
It's quite comprehensive. I'm also interested in how photographs come out in the world and who gets the access and all that. So there's like a wonderful story of, I guess, a reopening of an iconic and historically significant store in Chinatown. And one of the descendants who opened the store just happened to run into Corky, and on the spot asked him if he would do an exhibit at the store. And he did that. And I'm curious about kind of where his photos are shown. whether the kinds of audiences he reached. Can you tell maybe stories about like what impact those photographs had and how it mattered, like the form in which his photographs reached them? If it's the New York Times versus an exhibit in Chinatown, this book. And I understand that you had planned an exhibit of his work that didn't quite come into fruition because of his untimely passing, but it was supposed to take place at Columbia. So what are the different audiences and which one, who did he want to see his work? Who are these images for?
Well, they're for us, they're for Asian Americans, and there are for the general public, right, whom we need to educate. Corky had many shows, many exhibits over the course of his career, going back to at least the early 80s. He showed them in museums, he showed them at galleries, he did many campus events. Many colleges invited him. And so he really did see his exhibits as a way to educate people. And he was especially interested in going to college campuses and to mount exhibits. He had a big exhibit at the Museum of Chinese in America, MoCA in New York. And the exhibit you're referring to at Pearl River Mart, which is an iconic goods store in Chinatown. Joanne Kwong, who's the president of Pearl River, asked him to do a show there. So he did a show there called Chinatown on My Mind, which was a riff on Gordon Parks's Harlem on My Mind. And he did shows big and small, not just in New York, all over the country, and not just at colleges. He did things at the Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles, the Chinese American Museum in Washington, D.C. So he exhibited widely, and I believe the plan of the Corky Lee estate is to consolidate and organize his archive and then make it available, probably to deposit it in an institutional library to preserve it in perpetuity, and also to make his photographs available for exhibit and for reproduction.
I want to make time for questions, but I just have one more if you will indulge me. You just mentioned Gordon Parks, who's an incredibly influential African-American photographer, and it suggests that this rift showed that he was in dialogue or was influenced by other photographers. And perhaps in turn, like he worked with other photojournalists and did some work in ensuring that other Asian Americans would have recognition within that industry. Can you speak a bit about how he mentored the next generation of Asian American photographers? How did he contribute to that, and what was the work that he was doing in transforming how we see Asian Americans through photography?
Corky was a longtime member of the Asian American Journalists Association, and he helped start a photojournalist section of the AAJA, which had previously been dominated by print reporters and broadcast journalists. So Corky was instrumental in starting the photojournalist section. And every year when they had their conventions, he would hold an auction, and he would organize other photographers to donate their prints for auction. And through AAJA, as well as in the community, he actively mentored younger photographers. He took them under his wing. He worked with them as teachers, as instructors. A lot of people tailed him, around. He was one of the founding members of A4, which is the Asian American Arts Alliance in New York, which is brought together both our so-called OGs, our older generation of artists and creatives, with younger people. So he was always had the time, always had the enthusiasm, always had the interest to mentor younger photographers. So after Corky passed away, in May of 2022, we held, the estate organized an exhibit called, I forget the name of it, but it was an exhibit of Asian American photographers. And there are a few of Corky's photographs in that exhibit, but mostly it was an exhibit of the work of 31 Asian American photographers, both longtime professionals, people like Marilyn Yee, who was a staff photographer for the New York Times for many years, but also all these young people that he had mentored. And the great thing about this exhibit was that it was held in the gallery of the U.S. District Courthouse in Brooklyn. And that is, I think, another kind of photographic justice, right? That a U.S. District Courthouse, a federal courthouse, would sponsor an exhibit of Asian American photographers.
It's just transforming the space visually, right? It's incredible.